What's up, guys? I've got kind of weird points to make, so bear with me. I'm gonna try to make them well. We'll see what happens. When you or someone you love or someone who you're consulting with their chart has a more difficult life than the normal amount of difficult, what does that tend to look like in charts? There's two houses that you're going to find planets either in their birth chart or by transit. And those are going to be the problem planets or the noisemakers. The two houses that predispose you to more drama, heartache, difficult situations, and things that are rather hard to fathom, like when you're asking how much can one person take, those types of questions. The culprit houses are the 8th house and the 12th house, and for different reasons. So the 8th house is notoriously a quote-unquote bad house. It is the house of sex, death, taxes, like the feds, other people's money. That's the traditional reading, but it's like also other people's psychological stuff. So people who have planets in the 8th house that they're using well, if a lot of planets, they tend to become the psychologists of the world, or they're natural psychologists, because they want to understand both what makes them and other people tick. It is a house that you're more in conscious control of than the 12th house, which I'll talk about in a second. But when you have planets in the 8th house and they are receiving transits, meaning that the sky is putting pressure in some way on planets that are in the 8th house, big things happen that seem to be out of the proportion of what would be normal. And so you can have quite a dramatic life. But when you have planets that are in the 8th house, like, this is your energy. So it is incumbent upon you, if you want to be a well-adjusted human being, to learn how those planets work. And so watch the sky. Watch the sky for when you have the more minor planets coming at you, meaning Mars, sometimes Jupiter. If you're sensitive to Mercury or Venus, use those. But see what happens when the planets that you have in the 8th house get stimulated by transiting outer planets, and begin to catalog and use that information. So it's like, because the 8th house planets tends to be planets that express themselves in compulsive ways, especially when you're younger. And as you age and mature, you learn to fight some of those impulses to stir up drama or be ridiculous, because you're like, that wastes so much of my energy and it takes me months, if not years, to dig out. When it's in my conscious control, which it isn't always, but like, basically know thyself. You cannot control for what will happen when the sky does things to your 8th house planets, but you can begin to understand the mechanics of how that energy typically expresses in your own behavior, or how it typically expresses in terms of things that you tend to encounter. So the longer that you get to know your own chart, you will begin to see trends. And that is why, in my opinion, astrology is super useful, because charts are the rules of the game for the person whose chart you're looking at. So when you have 8th house planets, the rules of the game are more extreme rules than people who don't have planets in the 8th house. Period. The end. And so you have to understand that about yourself and also accept it. And in some ways you need to let yourself off the hook, because you need to think like, okay, this is going to be more extreme whether I like it or not. But I can personally not make things worse. I can not step in it. I can try to learn to control myself, etc. So food for thought here. More extreme things happen when you have planets in the 8th house and the 12th house natally, period, the end. And then in times that you have major planets, by which I mean Saturn on out, transiting through the 8th house and the 12th house, your extreme things will happen and you will have to learn to deal with them. But that's why the shallow end of the pool is paying attention to what that energy does when it receives a transit, so that when bigger things come along, you can kind of hold yourself back, because the larger outer planets from Saturn on out will make you much, much, much more ready to act when you don't necessarily want to be acting on what your typical impulses would be. The 12th house, on the other hand, it's so much harder to understand because the 12th house is the subconscious house. The 8th house is intuitive. So people who have planets in the 8th house, like the sun or the moon, like if they're paying attention to their intuition, they're going to have pretty good intuition. Same with the 12th house, but it's much harder to trust the intuitive stuff that's coming out of the 12th house unless you are in a meditative state and you've learned to notice the difference between what are your psychological hang-ups and your phobias, because the 12th house is where we have a lot of phobias if you have planets in the 12th house. And I do, so I know what I'm talking about. You do tend to have some stuff where it's like, oh yeah, I'm always paranoid about that there's a monster under my bed. Like, oh, it's that again. When you're trying to be intuitive, you'll have moments where you feel really zen, and then it gets interrupted by, oh my God, there's a monster under the bed. And you're just like, no, that's typical. Like, let's get more like grounded and back into our like actual intuitive realm. You begin to learn these things about yourself, but you have to try much harder with 12th house stuff because it is subconscious. So people with a lot of 12th house stuff, especially Mars, and if you have Uranus in here, have sleep problems that can be lifelong. And they can have good periods and bad periods, but I have not yet met a person with Mars in the 12th house that doesn't have some kind of a sleep issue. It's just you don't have conscious control of anything that's in the 12th house. And when you have major transiting planets from Saturn on out making contact to these planets in the 12th house, the outcome of those transits is going to be beyond your conscious control. So obviously we're looking at Joe Biden. I'm not looking at him in a political way because I don't think I need to say it again. I like to focus on individual people and the stuff that we can see that's obvious. This man has had more than the normal amount of tragedy in his life, I believe, and just tough stuff that he has needed to deal with. And he is obviously at the point in his life where, knowing astrology or not, he's pretty used to having to go with the flow, which is very much a 12th house thing, and realize when the tide has turned against you. And I'm being a little bit silly there because going with the flow and tides turning, like, that has to do with water house energy, just sort of generally. And he's had Uranus opposing these planets and then beginning to oppose these planets. It's just like a time of disruption from the 6th house, which is like coworkers and super conscious stuff and critical thinking. 12th house planets do tend to be spacey and don't like to be nailed down. And the 6th house is where things get really nailed down. So it's just kind of like you have to embrace reality, like it or not. And I think that we have seen that in a very, very public way. So these are the culprit houses when it is apparent that someone is either going through difficulty or just has the type of life where you're just like, what is the universe trying to tell this person? I don't know how to say it in a way that really would make anybody feel better. It's not that the universe has something against these people. It's that the rules of the game, when you have a lot of 8th house or 12th house planets, are different rules. So if you were to make Joe Biden born earlier in the day, these planets would be in the 1st house. And he would have a lot more conscious control and a lot more individual drive that he could harness and do things. But he would also be a different person altogether. And I'm sure that there is somebody with this chart with all of this stuff down in the 1st house, but everything shifts backwards. So it's a different chart, different rules of the game, different outcomes. Just like I said with the 8th house, learning what the energy does when it's stimulated is really, really useful. But there's a certain level of acceptance that needs to come with that you don't necessarily have conscious control. It's hard to wrestle with. And I say that as someone with 12th house planets, that this week Saturn was exactly conjunct one of them, and I dealt with death. I dealt with interpersonal shit that is entirely out of my control, but I still bear some responsibility because it involves me. So I need to act my best, even though I'm kind of at the mercy of a lot of other people. And also, just like some of the logistics of my life are going to need to change, and that's also completely outside my conscious control. And there's just the first couple of years that I did astrology, I was really annoyed at understanding that I had 12th house planets, and that meant that it explained a lot. It explained a lot of why, like, when I tried really hard at something and like really, really focused, things didn't seem to work out for me. I actually use that to justify like why I'm bad at basketball, because I have Mars in the 12th house, and I would like go and play so hard and be such a klutz. And it's just because like the more that you try to harness and have conscious control of 12th house planets off, when it's Mars especially, the worse it goes for you. So I took up non-contact sports, and that's been a boon for me. And you can hear me having memories of doing poorly at land sports that involved contact. You begin to learn how to compensate for energies that you don't have conscious control of. So I assure you, Joe Biden is used to this, whether he understands or not that he can't necessarily control the outcomes of his ego drives, or that he, in some cases, he just has to give up and sacrifice what he wants for what is ultimately going to be beneficial for other people. And I know that there's a very apparent situation right now, but I assure you that that's not new to him in his life. I will make one other point, just something that I see commonly, so I'm going to add the current sky. Here it is. So you can see Saturn is here by transit, and a couple weeks ago it was closer to this line. And remember, I'm not accounting for the movement of the solar system since he was born, so it's a little bit fuzzy. But this line is the IC. I can't pronounce it because it's Latin, but I'll try. It's Imam Coli, means bottom of the sky. This is the line that denotes the end of the matter. So when you have Saturn crossing this line, regardless of who you are, you tend to see endings, because Saturn certainly will end stuff, and this is an ending point. This line can represent the end of your life, and that means death, but it's like what you could expect the end of your life to be if you had planets here. That would be one indicator. And I don't mean to sound morbid, but Pisces at the end of your life, that's pretty good, is you're kind of like drifting off. And I'm not saying he is. That's not my intention. This is also the line of who you are deep down in your most private self. But what tends to happen when Saturn crosses this line is endings, and Saturn is a career indicator. So a lot of the time when you see Saturn here, it's both the end of something and the beginning of something else. So the end of one way of being and the beginning of another way. I've experienced that personally. And it's just something that's pretty common. But with Saturn, you often need to take your time in accepting, like, okay, one way of living is ending. And trust me, there will be another beginning. There's more. Most of the time. So 99% of the time, this doesn't mean you're going to die. But it does mean that one way of being is ending and another way of being is beginning. And then when Saturn makes its way all the way up here, which it does 14 years later, usually there are career highs. It's interesting. Again, I could keep going, but I won't. I just wanted to show you something that I noticed a couple of weeks ago. I was like, oh, Saturn is here. And what I had in my head previous to a couple of weeks ago, I was like, this is really not where you want to see Saturn for somebody who's trying to achieve something on a national scale. So that was my thought process earlier. Anyway, that's just a little bit about the 8th house and the 12th house that might be illuminating for some of you when you are wondering why life seems to be meaner to some people than it is to others. And I will talk about more fun stuff later, but, I just like saying everything I see. Thanks for watching.